In the year 1427, the city of Florence conducted something unprecedented. It was called the Catasto. It was the first comprehensive tax census in European history. Every household in the city had to declare its wealth, every asset, every piece of land, every business interest, every debt, every single item of value, from the largest palazzo to the smallest vegetable garden. The clerks who compiled the Catasto were not interested in history. They were tax collectors. They wanted to know who had money so they knew who to tax. They recorded names, occupations, household sizes, property values, business income, and debt obligations. They produced a document of extraordinary detail. For the first time in European history, a government knew exactly how much wealth its citizens held, exactly where that wealth was located, and exactly who controlled it. The tax census ran to thousands of pages. It took years to compile, and when the accountants finally finished their work, the numbers told a story that nobody found surprising at the time, but that would echo across the next 6 centuries. The richest 1% of Florentine households controlled 27% of the city's total wealth. The top 10% controlled nearly 70%. The poorest half of the city, the artisans, the laborers, the widows, the servants, held less than 3% combined. The median household declared assets worth roughly 50 florins. The wealthiest household, that of Cosimo de' Medici, declared assets worth over 120,000 florins. The ratio between the richest and the median was more than 2,000 to 1. This is not the interesting part of the story. Extreme wealth concentration in a pre-industrial city is not surprising. What is surprising, what is genuinely staggering, is what happened next, or rather, what did not happen. 600 years passed. The Republic of Florence fell. The Medici rose to become dukes, then grand dukes, then faded into irrelevance. The everyman character dressed as a general conquered Italy and redrew its borders. The Kingdom of Italy was unified. Fascism rose and fell. 2 world wars tore through the continent. The Italian lira was introduced and eventually abandoned for the euro. Every conceivable political and economic disruption that could have reshuffled the distribution of wealth, every force that should have leveled the playing field and allowed new families to rise, happened. And yet, in 2016, 2 Italian economists, Guglielmo Barone and Soro Massetti, published a working paper that should have been front-page news everywhere. They had taken the 1427 Catasto data, digitized the surnames, and cross-referenced them against modern Italian tax records. Their question was simple. Are the richest families of Renaissance Florence still the richest families today? The answer was yes. Not a weak statistical noise. Maybe there is a correlation. Yes, a robust, statistically significant. These are the same people. Yes, the surnames that appeared at the top of the 1427 tax rolls were, in 2016, significantly overrepresented among Florence's highest earners and wealth holders. The same families that dominated Florentine economic life 6 centuries ago continue to dominate it today. They are not just present, they are overrepresented. They beat the odds. They beat 600 years of revolutions and wars and currency collapses and regime changes. They survived everything. When I first read that paper, I had the same reaction most people do. How does a family stay rich for 600 years? That is roughly 25 generations. 25 times the wealth had to be transferred from one group of people to the next. 25 times the capital had to survive a death, a transition, a period of uncertainty. 25 times the family had to avoid the obvious mistakes, the bad investment, the bad marriage, the incompetent heir, the political miscalculation, the war that confiscates property, the revolution that redistributes land. 25 times they had to get it right. The odds of doing that by luck are effectively 0. They did not do it by luck. They did it with a system so consistent, so durable, so effective across centuries and across families and across political regimes that it deserves to be called what it was, a manual. An unwritten but rigorously enforced manual for keeping a family rich forever. When I say manual, I am not talking about a single leather-bound volume hidden in a Florentine palazzo. There is no physical book titled How to Stay Rich for 25 Generations that you can pull from a library shelf. The manual I am describing is a set of principles, rules of engagement, and structural mechanisms that appeared so consistently across the families that survived that they constitute something close to a playbook. The families did not invent it all at once. They inherited it in fragments, refined it in each generation, and passed it forward to their children. The manual was never written down as a single document, because it did not have to be. It was written into family constitutions. It was built into trust structures. It was embedded in marriage contracts and inheritance laws. It was carved into the very architecture of how capital moved from one generation to the next. The manual kept the elite families rich for 500 years. And the reason you have never heard of it, the reason nobody teaches it in school, the reason your financial advisor has never mentioned it, is that the manual was never intended for you. It was intended for them, and it still is. Let me show you how it works. Rule by rule, mechanism by mechanism, family by family. The first rule in the manual is the hardest to accept because it violates every instinct you have about what is fair. The rule is, never divide the capital. When a normal family accumulates wealth, what happens when the parents die? The assets get divided. This is what the law defaults to in most Western countries. It is what most parents want. It feels fair. Every child gets an equal share. A house is sold, so the proceeds can be split 3 ways. A business is liquidated or broken into shares distributed among siblings. An investment portfolio is divided into separate accounts. The family's economic base, whatever it took a lifetime to build, is fragmented. The elite families understood, as early as the 13th century, that equal division is the fastest and most reliable way to destroy dynastic wealth. If you split capital into 3 pools, each pool is smaller than the original and generates less income. Each pool is more vulnerable to one bad decision, one bad marriage, one spendthrift heir. In the next generation, each of those 3 pools gets split again. And now you have 9 fragments, none of them large enough to generate the income that supports an aristocratic lifestyle. None of them large enough to command political influence. None of them large enough to matter. The math behind this is remorseless. Take a fortune of 100,000 florins. Invest it at 5%. If you leave it intact for a century, it grows to roughly 1.3 million florins through compound interest. If you split it equally among 3 children every generation, each of whom invests their piece at the same 5%, the combined family wealth after a century is roughly 230,000 florins. The intact fortune is more than 5 times larger. Over 5 centuries, the gap becomes incomprehensible. The intact fortune grows to over 300 billion. The split fortune grows to roughly 5 million. The difference is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. The elite families did not discover this arithmetic. They felt it. They observed that families who split their wealth disappeared within a few generations, while families who kept it together survived. And so they built legal mechanisms to enforce what the math demanded. In England, the mechanism was called fee-tail, or entail. It was formalized in the Statute of Westminster in 1285, but its roots went back further. Fee-tail meant that land could only be inherited by a specific line of descendants, usually the eldest son and his male heirs. The land could not be sold. It could not be given away. It could not be broken up and distributed among multiple children. It was locked into a predetermined chain of inheritance that could stretch across centuries. On the European continent, similar mechanisms existed under different names: majorat in France and Spain, fideicomissum in Roman law jurisdictions. The details varied, but the core principle was identical. The eldest son got everything. The younger sons got nothing, or nearly nothing. They became military officers, clergymen, colonial administrators, or they simply left. Daughters received dowries, which transferred wealth out of the family and into their husbands' families. The family unit was not a family in the modern sense. It was a corporation designed to preserve a single pool of capital across generations. This was brutal. It destroyed the life prospects of younger sons and turned daughters into bargaining chips. Nobody pretended otherwise. But from the perspective of capital preservation, it was flawless. The capital stayed intact. It compounded. The family grew richer, not poorer, with each generation. The second rule is equally cold. You do not marry for love. You marry for consolidation. Every marriage is a merger. It combines 2 balance sheets. It merges 2 income streams. It creates a new economic unit that will either accumulate capital or destroy it over the next 4 decades. The elite families never forgot this. They treated marriage as the single most important financial decision a family member would ever make, and they did not leave it to the family member. They managed it at the family level. the same way a corporation manages an acquisition. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founded the family bank in Florence in 1397. He understood that banking was a trust business. You lend money to people who trust you. People trust you when you are connected to other people they already trust. Marriage was the mechanism for building those connections. The Medici married into the Tornabuoni family, which brought banking relationships and political influence. They married into the Orsini family, one of the great Roman noble houses, which brought aristocratic legitimacy and access to the papal court. They married into the Salviati family, another Florentine banking dynasty, which brought additional capital and market access. Every marriage was a strategic acquisition. Every bride brought a network, a reputation, and a political alliance. The family's capital grew not just through compound interest, but through the consolidation of assets from allied families. The Rothschilds pushed this logic to its extreme. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who founded the dynasty in the Frankfurt ghetto, wrote explicit instructions into his will. The family's wealth was to stay inside the family. Rothschilds were to marry Rothschilds. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married nieces. Between 1824 and 1877, of the 36 marriages among Mayer Amschel's descendants, 30 were between first cousins. 4 of his granddaughters married 4 of his grandsons. The capital did not leave the bloodline. No outsider could reach it through divorce. No outsider could influence how it was deployed. No outsider could fragment it in the next generation. This was not love. This was architecture. The family was a closed financial system, and the marriage rules were the seal that kept it closed. The third rule requires a shift in how you think about money itself. Information is the real currency. Capital follows information. Whoever knows first wins. Before the telegraph, before the telephone, before any form of electronic communication, information traveled at the speed of a horse. A message from London to Paris took 2 to 3 days in good weather. A message from London to Vienna took a week or more. Financial markets moved on news. The price of a government bond depended on whether the government was winning or losing its wars. The price of wheat depended on whether the harvest in Prussia had been good or bad. The price of everything depended on information that was, by its nature, unevenly distributed. Whoever received it first could buy before the market moved. Mayer Amschel Rothschild understood this with perfect clarity. He had 5 sons. He sent each of them to a different European financial capital. Nathan went to London. James went to Paris. Salomon went to Vienna. Karl went to Naples. Amschel, the eldest, stayed in Frankfurt. The 5 brothers formed an information network that spanned the continent. They used private couriers, who rode faster than the public mail. They used coded messages that could not be intercepted and read. They used carrier pigeons for the most urgent signals. They paid informants in every major government, every major port, every major commodity exchange. They knew things before anyone else knew them. The most famous example, possibly embellished by legend but grounded in a real structural advantage, involves the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The British government, the French government, and every financial market in Europe were waiting for news of the outcome. Nathan Rothschild in London received the news of the everyman character, dressed as a general's defeat, before the British government did. His couriers had ridden through the night from Belgium. When the London Stock Exchange opened the next morning, Nathan began selling British government bonds. Other traders, watching the great Rothschild sell, assumed he knew something they did not. They panicked. They sold too. Bond prices collapsed. And then Nathan, through a network of agents, bought everything back at the collapsed price. When the official news of victory arrived hours later, bond prices soared, and the Rothschilds had multiplied their position. Whether every detail of that story is true is debated by historians. What is not debated is the structural reality behind it. The Rothschilds had faster information than their competitors. That advantage was not a one-time trade. It was persistent. It compounded. Every piece of intelligence that arrived hours or days before the public markets received, it allowed the family to position its capital ahead of the move. Over decades, this asymmetry generated a fortune that, at its peak in the mid-19th century, was estimated at over $400 billion in today's terms. That fortune was not built on a better banking product. It was not built on superior lending rates. It was built on knowing things first. The manual recognized that information asymmetry is the purest form of competitive advantage because it requires no physical assets, no factories, no armies, and no natural resources. It requires only a network and the discipline to use it. The fourth rule sounds like a principle from a modern business school case study, but it was perfected in the early 16th century by a man who was already dead when modern business schools were invented. Own the infrastructure. Do not just participate in the market, control the market. Jacob Fugger was born in Augsburg in 1459. His family was already wealthy from textile trading, but Jacob transformed their fortune into something the world had never seen. He began lending money to the Habsburg emperors, Maximilian I and later Charles V. These were not normal commercial loans. They were loans to sovereigns who needed cash to finance wars, bribe electors, and maintain their courts. The interest rates were high. The collateral, in theory, was the full faith and credit of the Holy Roman Empire. In practice, sovereign borrowers rarely repay in full. Jacob knew this. He did not want repayment in currency. He wanted repayment in assets. When Maximilian could not repay, Jacob accepted silver mines in Tyrol as settlement. He accepted copper mines in Hungary. He accepted monopoly rights to sell those metals across the empire. He accepted toll concessions on trade routes. He accepted the right to mint coins. Every default was an opportunity to convert a financial claim into a physical asset. By the time of his death in 1525, Jacob Fugger controlled the majority of European copper production and a significant share of European silver. His personal fortune was estimated at roughly 2% of the entire European gross domestic product. To put that number in context, 2% of the United States economy today would be over $500 billion. The wealthiest person in the world today controls roughly 0.3% of the American economy. Jacob Fugger was operating at a scale that has never been replicated, and he achieved it by following the rule that the manual would permanently encode. Do not buy the commodity, buy the mine. Do not lend to the powerful. Become the infrastructure the powerful cannot function without. The Medici developed their own version of this rule. They did not just lend money to the papacy. They became the Pope's bank. They handled the collection of papal revenues from every diocese in Europe. They managed the transfer of funds from every Catholic country to Rome. They financed the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. They advanced the money that paid for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. They became so deeply embedded in the church's financial infrastructure that separating the two would have been operationally impossible. When you are the system, you cannot be removed from it. When you own the infrastructure, you cannot be competed against. The manual's instruction is clear. Do not win transactions. Become the transaction. The fifth rule is the subtlest and the most difficult to see from outside. Separate legal ownership from beneficial control. In medieval England, landowners faced a cascade of legal problems. When a landowner died, the crown could collect fees and taxes during the transfer of title. If the heir was a minor, the crown took control of the land and its revenues until the heir came of age. If the landowner was convicted of a felony, the land was forfeited to the crown. Land could not be left to the church in perpetuity. Land could be seized by a superior lord under feudal rights. The legal system was designed to extract value from every major life event that affected land ownership. English lawyers in the 13th century developed a workaround. It was called the use, and it was the ancestor of everything we now call a trust. The landowner would transfer legal title to a trusted group of associates. These associates, the fiefs, were the legal owners, but they held the land for the benefit of the original owner's family. The family lived on the land. The family collected the rent. The family made the decisions about farming, improvements, and tenants. Legally, the land belonged to the fiefs. In reality, it belonged to the family. And because the fiefs never died all at once, the crown could never trigger a transfer tax. Because the legal owners were a rotating group, no individual conviction could forfeit the land. Because the structure was private, nobody outside it knew exactly who controlled what. This separated legal title from beneficial ownership. The separation was the entire point. It protected the asset from external threats. It allowed the asset to persist, regardless of what happened to any individual family member. It created a legal shell around the family's capital that no creditor, no tax collector, and no political enemy could penetrate. The use evolved into the trust. The trust became the central mechanism through which elite families protected their capital across centuries. A trust owns the assets. Trustees manage the assets according to a legal document that can specify exactly how the income is to be distributed, to whom, under what conditions, and for how long. The beneficiaries receive the income, but they cannot sell the assets. They cannot divide them They cannot borrow against them without trustee approval. They cannot lose them in a divorce because they do not legally own them. The trust is designed so that even the most reckless heir cannot destroy the family's capital base, because the heir was never given legal title to destroy. The Rockefeller family used this structure. The DuPont family used it. The Grosvenor family, the Dukes of Westminster, used it to hold onto their vast London property holdings for over 300 years. The Grosvenor estate today includes 300 acres of Mayfair and Belgravia, some of the most expensive real estate on earth. It is worth an estimated £10 billion. It has never been sold. It has never been divided. It is owned by a trust. The current Duke is a beneficiary. He collects the income, but he cannot sell Mayfair. The trust will not let him. The sixth rule is the one that most clearly separates the families that survived from the families that did not. Generate assets, never sell them, live on the income, never touch the principal. This is not a budgeting tip. It is a fundamental redefinition of what wealth means. The elite families did not measure their wealth in net worth. They did not calculate a number and watch it fluctuate. They measured their wealth in income streams. Land that produced rent every year, mines that produced ore every year, banks that produced interest income every year, government bonds that produced coupons every year, monopoly concessions that produced fees every year. The distinction matters because it changes every financial decision. If your wealth is a number, you protect the number. You sell when the number is threatened. You cash out when the number is high. You treat your assets as things to be liquidated at the right moment. If your wealth is an income stream, you protect the stream. You do not sell the asset because selling the asset destroys the stream. You endure the downturns because the income continues. You ignore the upturns because selling into an upturn also destroys the stream. The stream is the wealth. The capital value is irrelevant. This is the exact opposite of how almost everyone alive today thinks about money. The modern investor watches a screen. A number goes up, they feel rich. A number goes down, they feel poor. They buy when they are confident and sell when they are scared, which means they reliably buy high and sell low. They treat their portfolio like a scoreboard. The manual treated wealth like a farm. You do not sell a farm when grain prices are low. You do not sell a farm when your neighbor offers a premium. You harvest the grain every year. You pass the farm to your children. They harvest the grain every year. The farm is not the cash it would produce if you sold it. The farm is the food it produces forever. This is why the elite families held land for centuries. Land produces crops. It produces rent. It produces timber. It appreciates over very long time horizons. It cannot be stolen easily. It cannot be inflated away. It cannot default. It sits there, generation after generation, quietly compounding. The Medici held land. The Fuggers held mining rights that functioned like land. The Rothschilds held government bonds that functioned like land. The Grosvenors held London real estate that is the definition of land. None of them sold. None of them cashed out. The stream was the point. The seventh rule is the one that explains why so many wealthy families fail. The family is the business. When the family stops being the business, it becomes a consumer of the business, and consumers destroy capital. The Medici Bank collapsed roughly a century after it was founded, not because of competition, not because of a financial crisis, not because of a war. It collapsed because the third and fourth generations of the family stopped treating the bank as an enterprise to be managed and started treating it as a source of cash to be spent. Lorenzo the Magnificent, the most famous Medici of all, was a disastrous banker. He was a brilliant politician, a patron of Michelangelo and Botticelli, the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal. But he paid almost no attention to the bank. He let branch managers operate without oversight. He made political loans that would never be repaid. He withdrew capital for public works and artistic patronage. He consumed the machine that his grandfather Cosimo had built, and by the time he died in 1492, the machine was already breaking down. 2 years later, the French invaded Italy. The Medici were expelled from Florence. The bank collapsed. The family's political power evaporated. It took them nearly 40 years to return to Florence. And when they did, it was not as bankers but as clients of the Habsburgs and the papacy. They had exchanged their independent economic power for dependent political power. They were still wealthy, but they were no longer a dynasty. in the sense that Cosimo had built. The same pattern destroyed the Fugger family. Fortune. Jacob Fugger had no children. His nephew Anton took over and was competent. But the generation after Anton treated the fortune as permanent. They withdrew too much, reinvested too little, and lost the operational discipline that had created the wealth. By the end of the 16th century, the Fugger fortune had largely dissipated into loans that were never repaid, political obligations that produced no return, and consumption that produced no assets. This is the three-generation curse. The first generation builds, the second generation maintains, the third generation consumes. It has destroyed more fortunes than every war, every depression, and every market crash combined. The manual was explicitly designed to defeat it. The families that followed the manual produced heirs who were trained from childhood to be stewards, not consumers. They were taught that the capital belonged to the family, not to them. They were given income rights, not ownership rights. The trust structure enforced this legally. Even if an individual heir wanted to cash out, they could not. The manual built a cage around the capital that no single generation could unlock. The eighth rule operates on a timescale that modern financial thinking cannot process. Time is the only asset that cannot be competed away. The arithmetic of compound interest is taught to every high school student, but almost nobody internalizes what it actually means on a multi-generational timescale. $1 invested at 7% real return becomes $867 after 100 years. It becomes over $750,000 after 200 years. It becomes over $500 trillion after 500 years. The numbers become absurd, and they are absurd because no real-world investment has ever compounded at a consistent 7% real return for 5 centuries. Wars destroy capital. Revolutions confiscate it. Bad management dissipates it. Inflation erodes it. The theoretical arithmetic is impossible to achieve in practice, but the principle behind the arithmetic is not theoretical. The elite families understood that time was their greatest weapon. They did not try to get rich quickly. They did not chase high returns. They built structures designed to last. A government bond that returns 3% but survives the Napoleonic Wars generates more long-term wealth than a speculative venture that returns 30% for 2 years and then vanishes. A diversified portfolio of land, monopoly rights, and sovereign loans that returns 5% for 200 years creates more wealth than any short-term strategy, no matter how brilliant, that cannot survive a single crisis. This is the principle that modern institutional finance has almost completely abandoned. The entire industry is optimized for quarterly performance. Bonuses are paid annually. Investment horizons are 3 to 5 years. Nobody is compensated for thinking about what will happen in 2075. Nobody is rewarded for building structures that will survive the next century. Nobody asks the question the manual demanded of every generation. Will this still be here in 200 years? The manual was not a get-rich manual. It was a stay-rich manual, and staying rich across 5 centuries required an entirely different set of tools than getting rich across 5 years. It required legal structures that outlasted any individual. It required marriage strategies that prioritized consolidation over affection. It required inheritance systems that prioritized capital integrity over family harmony. It required an information network that gave the family an edge in every market. It required a definition of wealth that prioritized income streams over net worth. And it required, above all, an acceptance that the family existed to serve the capital, not the other way around. When you read the biographies of the families that made it, you notice something that cuts across centuries and national boundaries. The successful families were not fun to belong to. They were not warm. They were not places of unconditional love and support in the modern therapeutic sense. They were institutions. They had rules, hierarchies, expectations, consequences. Children were trained for roles they did not choose. Marriages were arranged for strategic reasons. Personal desires were subordinated to family interests. The individual existed to advance the dynasty. The dynasty existed to protect the capital. The capital existed to perpetuate the dynasty. The circle was closed and self-reinforcing. The families that rejected this model, that tried to be normal families who happened to have money, lost everything. The children grew up without the training. They married whoever they wanted. They split the assets equally because it felt fair. They sold the family business because nobody wanted to run it. They consumed their inheritance and left nothing for their grandchildren. Within 3 generations, the surname that had meant power and influence for centuries meant nothing at all. The manual is not a moral document. It does not claim to be good. It claims to be effective, and it is. The question you should be asking yourself right now is the question I asked myself when I first encountered these patterns. Why did nobody teach me this? Why is the manual, or the set of principles that constitute it, absent from every financial education curriculum? Why do schools teach compound interest as a sterile mathematical exercise rather than as a dynastic strategy? Why do financial advisors focus entirely on retirement planning with a 30-year horizon rather than wealth preservation across multi-generational timeframes? The answer is uncomfortable but not complicated. The manual was never intended for anyone outside the families that used it. Those families had no incentive to share it. In fact, they had every incentive to keep it hidden. A system that works by concentrating capital into a small number of hands depends on everyone else not understanding how it works. If every family practiced primogeniture, capital would still concentrate. If every family built trust structures, the dynastic advantage would narrow. If every family married strategically, held assets permanently, lived on income rather than capital appreciation, and trained their children as stewards rather than consumers, the distribution of wealth would look very different. The elite families understood this. The manual was their proprietary technology. They guarded it. They embedded it in family traditions that outsiders could not observe. They wrote it into legal documents that were never made public. They taught it to their children in private. And meanwhile, the rest of the world was taught something very different. You were taught to split your assets among your children because that is fair. You were taught to marry for love. You were taught to diversify your portfolio and sell when you need cash. You were taught to retire, consume your savings, and die with enough left over to give each child a check. You were taught to be a normal person with a normal relationship to money. And there is nothing wrong with being a normal person. But normal people do not stay rich for 500 years. The manual was not designed for normal people. It was designed for the families who intended to own the future. And it worked. Consider the Grosvenor family. Their wealth did not begin in Italian banking or German mining. It began in 1677. When a young man named Thomas Grosvenor married a 12-year-old heiress named Mary Davies. Mary's dowry included 500 acres of swamp and pasture land just west of the old city walls of London. It was called the Manor of Ebury. Today, you know it as Mayfair and Belgravia. The Grosvenors did not sell the land when London expanded around it. They did not sell it when developers offered fortunes for parcels. They did not sell it when the family needed cash. They leased it. Every building in Mayfair and Belgravia sits on land owned by the Grosvenor estate. Every shop, every restaurant, every embassy, every grand townhouse pays ground rent to the Duke of Westminster, who is the current head of the family. The estate is worth an estimated £10 billion. It has been in the family for nearly 350 years. It generates income every year. It has never been split among heirs. It has never been sold. It is owned by a trust. The Duke is a beneficiary. He cannot sell it if he wanted to. The trust will not let him. The manual would approve. The same patterns appear wherever you look for them, once you know what to look for. The Wallenberg family in Sweden controls roughly a third of the Swedish stock market through a network of foundations and holding companies. The family has been doing this since the 1850s. The foundations are trusts by another name. They own the shares. The family members sit on the boards of the companies. The shares control, but the family members do not own the shares. Personally, they cannot sell them. They cannot divide them. The capital stays intact generation after generation while the family harvests the influence and the dividends. The Agnelli family in Italy controls Fiat and a vast network of industrial and financial companies through a similar structure. The Haniel family in Germany controls a diversified industrial conglomerate through a family holding company that has existed since the 18th century. The Cargill and Mars families in the United States own their companies outright, refuse to go public, and are notoriously secretive about their internal governance. None of this is accidental. None of these families stumbled into multi-generational wealth. They built their structures deliberately. They followed the manual, whether they called it that or not. The modern wealth management industry has repackaged parts of the manual for its clients. but it has done so selectively. If you walk into any private bank with $10 million or more, the relationship manager will talk to you about trusts. They will mention family limited partnerships. They will offer dynasty trust structures designed to last for multiple generations. They will help you write a family constitution that governs how wealth is managed, distributed, and transferred. These services are not secret. They are standard products in the private wealth industry, but they are only offered to clients who already have enough money to make them relevant. The industry has no incentive to teach the manual to the general public, because the general public is not the target market. A trust is expensive to set up and maintain. A family office requires tens of millions in assets to be cost-effective. Generational wealth planning is only commercially viable for families who already have generational wealth. The manual has been democratized in one sense. The legal tools are available to anyone who can afford them, but the knowledge of which tools to use and why, and how to combine them into a coherent multi-century strategy, that knowledge remains locked inside the families and institutions that have always had it. This is why the rich get richer, not because of compound interest alone, not because of access to exclusive hedge funds, but because they have a playbook that was developed, tested, and refined over half a millennium, and everyone else is improvising. The families that follow the playbook do not necessarily live happier lives. The evidence on that question is mixed at best. Aristocratic families throughout history have produced spectacularly unhappy individuals. Dynastic pressure crushes people. Being born into a role you did not choose, married to a person you did not love, expected to manage an enterprise you did not build, and forbidden from ever cashing out or walking away, is not a recipe for contentment. The manual was not designed for happiness, it was designed for survival, and on that metric, its record is unambiguous. Some of the families took the manual a step further and wrote it down explicitly. The most formal version is the family constitution. A family constitution is a written document, often 50 or 100 pages long, that governs how a family's wealth is managed across generations. It specifies who can serve as a trustee. It specifies what qualifications a family member must have to receive distributions. It specifies how disputes are resolved. It specifies under what conditions the family can sell assets. It specifies the values the family is expected to uphold and the consequences for failing to uphold them. The Pritzker family, who built the Hyatt hotel chain and a diversified industrial fortune worth over $30 billion, wrote one of the most famous family constitutions in modern American history. It governed everything from how family members were compensated for working in the business to how they could exit the family partnership. The Mars family, who own the candy company, have a constitution that restricts employment in the family business to descendants who have worked outside the company for at least 5 years and earned a graduate degree. You do not get a job at Mars because you share the name. You earn it. The Constitution enforces meritocracy inside a dynastic structure. These documents are the closest thing to a written version of the manual that exists in the modern world. They are not public. They are closely guarded, but their existence tells you something important. The families that survive understand that survival requires explicit rules. It cannot depend on good intentions. It cannot depend on family harmony. It cannot depend on hoping that the next generation will be as responsible as this one. It must be encoded. It must be enforceable. It must operate independently of any individual's judgment or character. The rules in these constitutions are not complicated. They are versions of the same principles that the Medici and the Fuggers and the Rothschilds followed 500 years ago. Do not divide the capital. Do not sell the assets. Marry carefully. Train the children. Govern through institutions, not individuals. Plan in centuries, not quarters. The technology of wealth preservation has not fundamentally changed since the Renaissance. It has only been refined. The final thing to understand about the manual is that it works whether you believe in it or not. The families that followed it did not need to be persuaded. They observed the outcomes. Families that divided their wealth disappeared. Families that kept it together survived. The mechanism did not require faith. It operated like gravity. If you split capital, it dissipates. If you keep it whole, it compounds. The math does not care what you think about primogeniture. It does not care that you find cousin marriage distasteful. It does not care that you would rather sell the family business and give each child an equal check. The math is indifferent to your values, and the math, over 500 years, is undefeated. So the next time you hear someone say that wealth never lasts more than 3 generations, that the curse always wins, that the rich eventually lose it all, you will know that this is not a law of nature. It is a choice. The families that chose differently chose a different outcome. They built structures that outlasted empires. They followed rules that violated every intuition about fairness and family and love. And they are still rich, not because they were smarter, not because they had access to better investments, but because they had a manual, and you did not. The manual never stopped working. It just stopped being taught to you.